Now with these next four problems, this is on page 3 by the way, we're starting at the top of page 3. We've got four different fractions inside a radical. And what we're going to do here is we've got to look at these and see, is this fraction easily simplified? So I put 16 over 25 in the calculator and hit math enter, or you can simplify it by hand, see what goes into the numerator, the denominator, and see if you can simplify it down anymore. And with these you can't. They're as simplified as they're going to get. So there's a way to solve these. What you've got to do is write it like this. You'll take the numerator and put it in its own radical sign, and then divide it by the denominator with its own radical sign, just like this right here. So it was the square root of 16 over 25. That becomes the square root of 16 over the square root of 25. They're the same thing. Either way you do this, these are the exact same thing. So this makes it a little bit easier. Now we can kind of see what we can do with this. So the square root of 16 gives me 4. The square root of 25 is 5. So that's a nice, easy way to simplify that down. So that's number 1. Number 2, we have the square root of 4 over 9. And again, it won't simplify down at all from here. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and write out a radical sign on top and a radical sign on the bottom. Ooh, it's an ugly 9 there. So we have the square root of 4 over the square root of 9. Well, the square root of 4 we know is 2. Square root of 9 is 3. So again, very easy so far. Not much to these. Shouldn't be very difficult just yet. Square root of 5 over square root of 9. That's what we've got to write down here. So, because that will not simplify down any farther than it already is. We're just going to keep doing what we do. Now, it's pretty obvious the bottom, the denominator, is going to be 3, because you take the square root of 9 and you get 3. But what about the top, the square root of 5? If you put that in your calculator, it's going to give you a decimal. And we don't want decimals in these. We're not looking for decimals. So, what you simply do is just leave it how it is. Square root of 5. That's as simple as it will go. You can have a radical sign in your answer as long as it is in the numerator. If it's in the denominator, you cannot have that, and we'll get to that here in just a second. Let's do this last problem here. We have the square root of 14 over 25, so that's going to become the square root of 14 over the square root of 25. Well, again, the bottom simplifies very easily. That becomes 5. And then square root of 14. You can try and simplify that down. It will not simplify at all. So you're just going to leave it like that. Square root of 14, just like that right there. So that's a pretty easy way to look at these fractions. So don't be intimidated by fractions. Just leave it how it is right here. Alright, so now I've got numbers 5 through 8 up here, and so let's go ahead and start working these out. These are a little bit more complicated, and I'll show you why here in just a second. So this first one, this is number 5, by the way, on page 3. You've got the square root of 80 over 25. Well, let's go ahead and separate that into two different radicals. So square root of 80 over square root of 25. Well, that makes it a little bit easier to see. You can already see that you're going to have square root of 25 is 5, so that's going to be in your denominator. But what are we going to do with the square root of 80? Well, we have to go through and simplify this as much as we can, and then that's going to be my numerator. So I'm going to come over here and do this. So we'll start it right here. So we have to simplify this down. So what times what gives me 80? I know that 16 times 5 gives me 80. 5 is a prime, so I'm going to circle it. 16 breaks down into 8 times 8. 8 breaks down into 2 and 4. I'm going to circle my primes. Anytime I get to a prime, I circle it. 4 breaks down into 2 and 2. And then you can see that since we just factored out this 8 right here, we got 3 2's out of it. I can assume that this 8 over here is going to factor out to be 3 2's as well. So that's kind of a little shortcut there. So always circle my primes, that way I keep everything organized and I know where everything's at. So let's take a look and see what we got. Well, we've got a pair of 2's, so that's going to go on the outside. I'll write it down here. We have another pair of 2's, so we multiply times 2 here. We have another pair of 2's, so that's going to be on the outside. And then we have a 5 left over, so that goes on the inside. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, square root of 5. And this is your final answer. There's one key thing. You might look at this and say, well, why didn't we simplify these 5's right here? Because we have a 5 here and a 5 here. Normally we would cancel those out. You're not going to do that in this case, because if you look here, you're going to see that this is underneath a radical sign. So this is not technically 5, this is the square root of 5. So this and this are not the same number. Now if you had a 5 that was outside of the radical sign, you could cancel those out. But if one is inside the radical sign and one is not inside a radical sign, you cannot cancel those out. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and take a look up here at number 6. So we've got the square root of a to the 5th over 81a. Well, right away I can see something that I can go ahead and simplify just a little bit. You have a to the 5th divided by a. Well, remember, if you have exponents with similar bases, we can go ahead and divide those, which really means you're subtracting them. So this is really a to the 1st. So what's 5 minus 1? 4. So this is now going to become a to the 4th divided by 81. Basically, this a down here canceled out with one of the a's up here. And that's how we get that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look and see, we got to split this up into two different problems. So we got square root of a to the 4th over the square root of 81. This one looks like it's going to be a little bit cleaner than that last one. Well, remember, when we have exponents on a variable, to take the square root of it, all you do is divide it by 2. So I'm going to divide that 4 by 2, and that's going to leave me with the square root of, or a squared, whoops, I'm sorry, not the square root of a squared, it's just going to leave me with a squared. So that is a squared. Alright. And now the square root of 81 is going to be 9. And this cannot be simplified down any farther than it already is. Alright, so we look at this next problem, number 7, and we need to go ahead and simplify this down. So we have the square root of 5a to the 5th over the square root of 9. And again, it's easy to see here that you're going to have the square root of 9 is 3 on the bottom, so the denominator is pretty easy on this part. But what we need to do now is we need to simplify this numerator as much as we can. Well, we know the square root of 5 won't simplify down any farther, so I'm going to leave it just like that right there. So I'm going to leave that as the square root of 5. But this a to the 5th, though, we've got to take the square root of that. And remember, if you have a exponent, what you've got to do is you divide it by 2. So I'll do a quick recap on what we did the other day if you've already seen this lesson. You divide this exponent by 2, just like that right there. So 2 goes into 5 how many times? It goes into it 2 times. 2 times 2 is 4. 5 minus 4 gives me 1. So that means I have a remainder of 1. That's from like way back in 2nd, 3rd grade right there. So this means that this number right here, I'll change color so you can see it. I'm going to pull out an a, and I'm going to put this as my exponent with that. So a squared comes out, because this number is my exponent, and then my remainder of 1, that tells me that I have 1a left inside here. So just to recap that, this number is my exponent. This number tells me how many are still underneath the radical sign. And then this entire thing is my answer. Okay? So that's that one. Now we need to go and see about this next one here, number 8. Well, let's go ahead and simplify this down into two different problems. So we have the square root of 45a to the 5th over square root of 4a to the 5th. Now, what's one thing you can see immediately here that we can go ahead and cancel out that's in both of these? And it's underneath the radical on both of these, so we can do this. They both have a to the 5th power. So Since they're both underneath the radical sign and they both have it, we can go ahead and cancel it out. So we don't have to deal with that anymore. That's good. Well, let's take a look here then. So we've got the square root of 4. I know that's going to be 2. That's an easy one. Square root of 45 is a little tougher, so let's go over here and break this down. 45 breaks down into 9 times 5. And we've got 5 as a prime, so I'm going to circle it. 9 breaks down into 3 and 3. And I circle both of those primes as well. And now I look and see, okay, I've got a 3 that's going to come outside of the radical sign, and I cross those off because I have a pair of them. Always pull your pairs outside, and then whatever's left over is going to go on the inside, which in this case is a 5. So there we go. That is numbers 5 through 8. Now the next problem is numbers 9, 10, and 11. Are a special kind of radical that we cannot leave the way it is. If the denominator contains a radical expression that's not a perfect square, you've got to multiply the fraction by that radical expression. And what I mean by all that is to say this. You look at this first one here. This is number 9 on page 3. My denominator has the square root of 3 in it. You cannot have a radical sign in the denominator in your answer. So this is not simplified down yet. And normally what we would have is if we had like square root of 4, you would just simplify that down to 2. Or the square root of 9, you would simplify down to 3. Well, we don't have that. We have the square root of 3 and it doesn't simplify down. So what we've got to do is we have to multiply this entire fraction by the square root of 3. So we do it like this. Times the square root of 3 over the square root of 3. Now, why am I allowed to multiply by the square root of 3 over the square root of 3? It looks like I'm just pulling this number out of thin air, and I can just multiply it by whatever I want to do and just change the problem around. I'm not really doing that, actually. If you notice, the square root of 3 over the square root of 3 is the same thing as 1. Remember, anything, we can do it like this right here. If we had 5 divided by 5, that's going to be the same thing as 1. Same thing in this case. We have the same thing on the top and the bottom. So I'm really just multiplying this times 1, which isn't changing anything. I'm just making it look different. So what we're going to do now, we're going to multiply straight across the top and then straight across the bottom. So let's go ahead and do that. The top part's nice and easy. That's just going to be 3x square root of 3. All you really do on that top part is just kind of squish them together in this case. Divided by, now square root of 3 times the square root of 3. What does that leave me with? The square root of 9. Well, we need to simplify that down a little bit because I know that the square, I'm going to write it down here, the square root of 9 is actually what? 3. So I can rewrite this as 3x square root of 3 over 3. So we've almost got this one completed. What is the one thing that we can do to simplify this a little bit farther? You can see that we've got some 3's we can cancel out. Now the question is, can we cancel out this 3 and this 3? Or this 3 and this 3? And the answer is we have to take the one that is outside of the radical sign. Since this is in the radical sign, it's kind of like that radical sign is protecting it. You're not allowed to touch this. So you take the ones that are outside and you can cancel them out. So that's going to leave you with an answer of x times the square root of 3. And that is number 9. Number 10, you see we've got the exact same thing. We have a square root in the bottom that we cannot simplify, so we've got to multiply by that square root. So square root of 6 over square root of 6. And again, all I'm really doing is multiplying this original problem by 1, so I'm not changing anything. I'm just making it look different. So let's go ahead and do this. The top part is easy, the numerator. So we have 2x times the square root of 6 just becomes 2x square root of 6. Divided by the square root of 6 times the square root of 6, and that's going to leave me with the square root of 36. Okay. Now I'll come down here and rewrite this because we know that the bottom can be simplified a little bit more. So we have the square 2x times the square root of 6 over, now what is the square root of 36? Well, that's going to leave me with a 6 down here, okay? And just like the problem before, we can simplify this a little bit farther. Again, we can't cancel out the 6's because this one's underneath that protective radical sign. But we have the fraction 2 over 6. That will reduce down So that reduces down to a 1, that reduces down to a 3. So that's going to leave me with x square root of 6 over 3. Or you could put 1x if you want to, because that 1 is right there. Either one is fine, but this is your final answer. Now, this next one we're going to do, look at it the exact same way. We can't simplify this down any farther, so you know the drill. Let's go ahead and multiply by that denominator. So it's times the square root of 6x times the square root of 6x. And on this one, I'm going to show you a little bit of a shortcut with the denominator. So let's go ahead and do the numerator first. So 3 times the square root of 6x, that's just going to be 3 square root 6x. All you're really doing is just kind of squishing those together. Now, in the bottom part, I'm going to look at this and I'm going to say, well, we've got the square root of 6x times the square root of 6x. Well, what did we get over on these first two problems? So I had the square root of 3 times the square root of 3. I ended up with a 3. Square root of 6 on this one times the square root of 6, I ended up with a 6. So on this one, I'm going to show you the shortcut. It's just square root of 6x times the square root of 6x is going to leave me with 6x. It's going to work like that every single time. If you have the square root of 5, so I'll write it up here, the square root of 5 times the square root of 5, it's going to give you a 5. If you have the square root of 10 times the square root of 10, it's going to give you a 10. Same applies for this. So that's a little bit of a shortcut that'll save you that extra step of having to take that square root right there. Now what we can do is we can simplify this as far as we can. So we look at the numbers that are outside of my radical sign. 3 will reduce down to 1, 6 will reduce down to 2, and so my final answer on that one is going to be square root of 6x over 2x. And again, since that 1 is right there, you can write a 1 in here for your answer. That's fine. They're both technically correct. Alright, so these are the last two problems of the lesson. So let's go ahead and get started on these. These are just like the other three that we just worked on. So we've got a radical on the bottom that we cannot simplify. So what do we have to do? We've got to multiply by that number. So multiply by the square root of 12m over the square root of 12m. The top part's the easy part. Just squish those together. So 12 times square root of 12m over, and then what's our shortcut? Remember, square root of 12m times square root of 12m is going to simplify down to simply 12m. Okay? And then from here you can see that all we've got to do really quick is just cancel some things out. We've got a 12 on the outside and a 12 on the outside down here, so we cancel those. So what's that going to leave me with? My final answer is going to be square root of 12m over m. So that was a real quick one, nice and easy. And you'll see as you do these, you'll get used to doing them a lot quicker. You'll see some little patterns happening that you can do on every single one of these. Last problem here, this is number 13 on page 3. We've got a radical in the bottom that we cannot simplify, so I'm going to go ahead and multiply by that number over here. Square root of 6m over the square root of 6m. On the top, multiply straight across the top, that's going to give you 2 square root of 6m over 6m on the bottom, because remember our shortcut, the square root of 6m times the square root of 6m is just 6m. And then I can go through and cancel things out or simplify if I need to. Let's see, we've got a 2 over 6 reduces down to 1 over 3, and you can do that in your calculator by hitting math enter. So that will leave us with a final answer of square root of 6m over 3m. And again, you can put that 1 right up there in the top if you want to. You don't have to. Either one of those is the correct answer. So this is your lesson on simplifying these radical signs when they're in the denominator.